Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. Like most knitters, I am not a fan of weaving in yarn tails. Whenever possible, I use the Russian join or a spit join so I can minimize the number of yarn tails I need to deal with when I'm finishing a project. However, there are times when neither of those options work well. Right now, I'm knitting my Cereus sweater, and it's time for me to join in a new piece of yarn. But I can't use a spit join because I'm using super wash wool and it won't felt. And because this stitch pattern is very plain, I also can't use the Russian join because that little bit of extra bulk where the join occurs will be very noticeable in my fabric. So when it's time to join in a new yarn, I'm using the tried and true method of working a stitch with both the old yarn and the new yarn. First, I'll demonstrate one method for working 2 stitches into the same lower stitch, but I hope you'll stay tuned because I'm also going to show you how to quickly and neatly weave your yarn tails into ribbing. Let's get started. It's time for me to add a new yarn into my sweater. And I would normally join a yarn that's the same color as the one I'm working with so I could continue knitting, but today I'm going to demonstrate with a contrasting color. I've worked right up to the edge of my rib with my old yarn, and now I need to add in the new yarn. This can be manipulated with your knitting needles, but I often find it easier to just use a crochet hook. I want to attach the new yarn so it forms a stitch that comes out of this same lower stitch as the stitch that I just worked. So I'm going to insert my crochet hook from the knit side of my fabric through to the purl side. And in this case, the knit side of my fabric happens to be at the back. Now that my hook is through, I can loop my new yarn around the hook and pull that loop back through the stitch. And now you can see that loop, with that loop, there's 2 stitches coming out of that same lower stitch, one with the old yarn, one with the new yarn. Before I can start knitting, I need to seat this new stitch on my knitting needle, and I want to make sure that it's mounted on the right hand needle conventionally, just like my previous stitch. So that means I'm going to put it on the needle so that the right leg of the stitch is at the front and the right, oh, I have it backwards. The right leg of the stitch is at the front, and that right leg is connected to the yarn tail. The left leg of the stitch is at the back, and that left leg is connected to the working yarn. So now I could just continue knitting on with my new yarn. And when I meet this twin stitch again, where the 2 loops are coming out of the same lower stitch, I would just treat these 2 loops as if they were a single stitch and either knit them or purl them together, whatever the pattern calls for. And then later on, I'd finish it off by weaving in these yarn tails. And that may mean pulling them through to the wrong side of the fabric, but if you're weaving into a rib, it can be nearly invisibly done on either the right side or the wrong side. Ribbing is a nice structure for concealing yarn tails because it's easy to read your work. The yarn tails don't interfere with the stretch or the drape of the fabric, and the yarn tails will be hidden almost completely invisibly. Generally, I'd wait a little bit longer to weave in my tails, and I also want to make sure that I'm not weaving both tails in the same direction. I would want to go different directions. So I'm going to weave this green tail up the edge of this knit rib. Throughout the process, my yarn needle is going to stay pointing in the direction that I'm weaving in the tail. if we look closely, you can see that all of the stitches along this edge are slanted up and to the right. So I'm going to pull my yarn needle under each leg so that it slants up and to the left. And this kind of makes an X with the leg of each stitch. After I pull the yarn through, the exposed part of the yarn tail is going to slant in the same direction as those stitch legs, which is what helps conceal it in neatly. So here I'm using a contrasting color, and you can see that even with the contrasting color, the yarn tail is concealed pretty well. You can't see it too much. When you're using the same color yarn as what you're weaving into, it's almost invisible. Generally, I weave in quite a bit farther than I probably need to. Just makes me feel a little bit safer. And once I'm done weaving in the tail, it's time to trim it off. So I'll just stop right there. So now I need to trim this yarn tail. I'm going to start by holding onto the yarn tail and kind of bunching up the rib a little bit so that more of the tail is exposed. Instead of giving this yarn tail a blunt cut that is going to pop out later and be seen, I like to kind of taper and feather the tip of the yarn. So to do that, I slant my scissors in the same direction as the twist of the yarn, and then instead of making one big cut, I make just a series of small little cuts until it breaks off. And then you can even go a step further and just kind of run the yarn between your fingers to kind of taper that so you don't have that blunt edge. You may even find a little bit of fuzz comes off, and that's fine too. After you have that nice feathered edge, you can straighten out your ribbing, and the tail is neatly concealed inside without a blunt edge popping out. I hope you enjoyed learning how to join in a new yarn by working 2 stitches into one, and also how to conceal those pesky yarn tails into the edge of ribbing. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for my Cereus sweater. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!